Good afternoon, Tony, and thank you very much for giving time to talk to the Mint.
It's my pleasure, Henry.
Brilliant. Well, I really was taken by the title of your textbook, the Anti-Textbook, and I've had a number of conversations about textbooks, whether they're good, bad, or we should get rid of them altogether. So I was really interested to discuss your textbook and also find out, how did you come, what was the beginning of the idea to have a anti-textbook?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in brief, it was probably the fact that I was teaching mainstream economics and I was disgusted with it. And I was increasingly disgusted with myself for teaching stuff that I didn't believe to be true. I mean, so this is probably, I had that feeling most strongly when teaching macroeconomics, because I'm a post-Keynesian, and would be my brand, that I would probably subscribe to or identify myself as most strongly. Though I've done an awful lot of work in mainstream neoclassical economics too. I mean, so probably I've had my best articles printed, published in using mainstream neoclassical stuff. But I mean, what bothered me the most in teaching macro is you at least in the years gone by, used to start off by getting students' attention by talking about the Great Depression and the policies that were implemented, which were actually making the situation worse. The classical economists, their view that wage flexibility would guarantee all market clearing.
Yeah.
Apples, well, you need to decrease the price of apples if you've got a surplus of apples, and decrease the wage of carpenters if you've got a surplus of carpenters, and if you've got a general surplus of unemployed workers, mass unemployment, then you need to push the average level of wages down. And of course, actually, that happened in the Great Depression. It didn't do a bit of good. And this was, at least at a certain point when we taught macro, this used to be the introduction. But Keynes solved the problem, he realized that you need to pump money into the economy, it needs to get going. And so that's great, and that all works fine to begin with. But then eventually the thing kind of comes back and eats its own tail by the time you've developed aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and you discover that actually the reason why you have unemployment is because wages don't fall, or fall fast enough, at least.
Yes, but sticky wages.
Yes, sticky wages. And I just go, no. I'm just dreading that students will put their hands up and say, "Excuse me, sir."
So did you feel you were forced, because you had to teach that curriculum, and did you think if you developed your own anti-textbook, that would give you license to teach differently?
Absolutely, it did. But of course, it took many years to gel, and the anti-text really started to move when a colleague of mine at UMB St. John, because I'm at University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. So a colleague named Rod Hill came to give a paper in Fredericton, and his paper was on the Easterlin paradox. And I just suddenly went, the lights went on. I said, well, we should work together and we should just produce a book.
You better remind the listener what the Easterlin paradox is.
Yeah. So the Easterlin paradox is that at a certain point, economists, or at least one economist, Richard Easterlin, decided he was actually going to use all this data that had been generated for years and sitting around unused, where people were asked about their happiness. How happy are you?
Yeah.
And so he just looked at the average happiness of income groups at a single country at a point in time, and discovered that the richer the income group, the happier they are. No surprise there. But then he looked at two other types of data. He looked at the average happiness of a country over time. So as the real GDP grew over time, did the average happiness in that country increase? And the answer was no, it didn't. And then he compared the average happiness of countries at a point in time, rich countries and poor countries, and found that rich countries weren't happier than poor countries. in an average term. So you have these two pieces of data suggesting that more money doesn't make you happier, and one piece of data that suggests more money does make you happier. Yeah. And he resolved the paradox by saying that this is perfectly consistent with relative income being the thing that matters.
Yeah.
And then that was kind of the start of the literature and the exploration of that idea. Is relative income all that matters? And eventually you get a Richard Layard, and I think he still has an ongoing website on this. That for a while there, the consensus was that no, relative income isn't the only thing that matters. At low levels of income, more money does bring you more happiness, but there's a limit to this, So it goes. It's got this kind of curve. This line does.
So how come that was the thing that sparked the idea for the anti-textbook?
Well, because that struck at the kernel of the whole thing, really. So economics. For microeconomics, when we talk about preferences, for example, preferences are clearly rather important in microeconomics. So we need, demand curves and all of this. We say, well, we don't know what people's preferences are. Well, one thing we do know, though, is that people want more.
Yes.
More is better. And as soon as you have more is better, well, that gives you the emphasis on efficiency and growth. Yeah. So you need that to explain the importance of efficiency and growth, although growth, of course, is a subsidiary item in the microeconomics bit, becomes more important in the macroeconomics bit.
So you started this first textbook with Rod Hill, sorry. And so when do you actually start? When did that start then?
So we started it, the first one was published in 2008, and Rod was a taskmaster and he was on sabbatical while I wasn't, and he really whipped me in shape. I'm a terrible procrastinator.
Right.
And I've never read enough before I start the writing, but he really cracked the whip. And so I don't quite know when we started it, but it didn't take us that long. Wow. So it came out in 2008, but the macroeconomics book then took a good deal longer because despite many entreaties to Rod to co-author that one with me, he refused, saying that he's not a macroeconomist and doesn't know enough about macro. So that
left you as a procrastinator to finish it. And how did the first textbook go? How was it received, particularly by your colleagues who were presumably many of them mainstream economists?
Yeah, well, the nature of the department where I'm situated has changed drastically over the last, 14 years. So, I mean, at the time, they didn't really notice. And other colleagues in other departments like sociology and political science and history, they were much more supportive and enthusiastic. Wow. We had a copy in the dean's, wall of fame and all of that sort of thing. But the colleagues were a little bit oblivious of it. Whereas this one, we got a mention in the new Microeconomics Anti-Textbook, got a mention in the heterodox economics newsletter. And many colleagues, were very supportive and, sent notes of congratulations. So, I don't know quite why that is, but my department is more supportive than it was.
All right, good. And did it, the first one, did it sell well, or do you know who bought it?
With regard to selling, and I don't quite know how the original publisher of this was Z Books, and they've since been taken over by Bloomsbury. But its claim to fame, it was the ebook version of it was the most illegally downloaded book they've ever published. So
illegally
downloaded book, yes. So this is our claim to fame. Wow. It did get taken up by some universities. I used to be able to remember which universities it it was.
Which countries? Maybe?
Which countries? Well, one in England, and there was a couple in Canada. So it was dotted around. I mean, not awfully much. Actually, right. There was on the same campus as us in Fredericton, there's another university called St. Thomas University. And there was a professor there who actually took it up. He had it as the textbook in his course, which actually gives rise to a little anecdote about what happens to these when students ask the questions.
I was very interested in that, yes.
Questions for your professor.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this colleague of mine, Andy Secord at St. Thomas, he adopted the book, and he had a very, very good student who went on to do an honours degree in economics, then went on to do a master's in a mainstream university in Ontario, and she became a tutor. So they had these mass lectures of 500 students that break them up into small tutorials, and they'd employ the graduate students for 1 hour a week to run these tutorials. Because she loved the Economics Anti-Textbook, she would introduce it to the students, and she told the students about the questions for your professor, and they would discuss them and all. And so what happened is that in this guy's mass lecture, students started putting their hands up and asking these questions. and of course, the guy, depending on the nature of the professor, you'd welcome these questions, because they're really well-honed questions, like straight to the point.
Yeah.
But this chap didn't, and he got most annoyed and sort of decided he was going to have to find out where these questions were coming from, and eventually tracked it down to this young lady's tutorial, and she got fired.
Seriously? She got fired?
Well, it wasn't all bad for her, because she sort of got redeployed to, some sort of marking assignment. So she still had her bursary. But yeah, no, they weren't going to put up with having really difficult questions being asked in these lectures. So, wow. I mean, it's kind of alarming, but, well, should I confess that Rod and I were really secretly pleased?
Yes, well, it certainly is a cause célèbre. I mean, it's interesting that, to some extent, what sparked the creation of Rethinking Economics, the student movement in the UK, was the fact that I think it was 2010 or something like that, when the students were looking to learn about the crash, there was only one course that was called Boom and Bust, which was taught by a guy who was on a temporary, short-term contract, who was then sacked because no one knows quite why. And the university said it was for undisclosable HR reasons, but the students thought that, that was the one course that they felt was interesting and relevant. And the university stopped it and sacked the guy.
Which university was it?
Manchester.
I think this is not at all surprising that he'd be sacked. But
he was terminated. He wasn't renewed. I think his contract wasn't renewed.
Yeah. And nor is it surprising that he was the only one dealing with the crash. In fact, I mean, the astonishing thing about macroeconomics textbooks is that they portray the financial sector as a source of great wealth creation.
Oh yeah.
And the channel through which savings is the mechanism rather through which savings are channeled into investment, and and because it's all the loanable funds diagram is the one that explains what's going on in the financial sector with your demand and supply. That of course, as soon as you have demand and supply, you're basically depicting an efficient market.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, it's a complete whitewash of the financial sector in the textbooks. There's and that's one of the reasons why we call it an anti-textbook as opposed to anti-mainstream economics, because the reasons why the financial sector isn't efficient and practically can't ever be efficient are well explained by mainstream economics, but they don't affect the textbooks. The textbooks ignore it. It's Panglossian. I mean, it's obviously imperfect and asymmetric information, right?
Yeah.
Which is rife in the financial sector, which gives rise to your three big problems, the principal agent problem and the insurance problem. That's called adverse incentive effect, and a third one. But so
why do you think that textbooks, and presumably this is still true, do this Panglossian thing that they ignore the critiques even within the mainstream, and they gloss over any issues to make it seem as though everything's largely sorted, and they tell us almost a good story as they can about how it's all going to be fine?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, for one thing, how would I know? But so you ask me what I think. I mean, is it that the textbooks? You got the incentive to sell textbooks for one thing, and that means that you can't go too far from the average textbook, and all the textbooks practically clones of one another, because you're trying to position yourself in the middle of the market. And then there's the aspect of,
why not, just one thing there, why no product differentiation? Because you think if you're cloning everyone else, well, why would they buy yours when if you come along with a new one? Why would they buy that rather than stick with the one that was there already?
Yes, so you do differentiate yourself, but it's really, really minor. You have to stick to the it's like political parties, right? I mean, the parties that's got its platform right in the median position of the voters is going to get votes to the left and to the right. And then, okay, so the right wing, is like way over to the right, and the left wing, if it can actually creep towards the middle and actually even a little bit to the right, is going to get all those voters to the left of it and some of those voters to the right. Yeah. So it's that kind of thing that's going on. So you've got minor product differentiation, but they're still really, really grouped towards the center, trying to capture that median thing, the votes to the left and to the right. But I mean, I think the other thing is that perhaps it's just not, I don't think that the generalist economist that is teaching this stuff, frankly, I don't think they're really aware of it. They're not really aware of these endemic problems in the financial sector. For example, otherwise, why would the mainstream textbooks, when they're talking about the financial sector, and nowadays, because the financial crash is, like, what is it, 14 years ago, it's just getting a mention now, whereas it used to have a whole chapter, about 10 years ago. Now it's just a brief mention. And they talk about reforms, right? And they say, oh, well, these reforms, it's all good. It's all good now. Don't worry. And it's, of course, it's complete nonsense. And the reason why it's complete nonsense is because the fundamental, not only do you have the problems of imperfect and asymmetric information, but what's driving the financial instability besides, all kinds of Minsky stuff, Minsky's cycles and super cycles. But what's really driving the financial instability is the leverage.
Yes.
Banks are got a leverage ratio about 50 times higher than the average corporation, the average non-financial corporation. And that is so that they can make a ton of money when things are going up. And that also gives them just this tiny fraction of stability when things are going down before they're underwater.
And then they'll get saved by the government.
Then they get saved by the government. So, now, what's her name? Admati, this wonderful American economist, Admati. She's written an awful lot of stuff on this, trying to get people to understand that the fundamental reform is that they need just way more equity being injected into the banking system. And if you keep the same leverage ratios that you have, then the fundamental cause of the instability remains. But because this is when we get into political economy, because the banks have got so much lobbying power over governments, it's almost impossible to get them to increase the the equity component of the banks. In fact, there was a commission set up that was looking at this, and the banks lobbied this commission, lobbied against recommending any increase in equity funding for banks. And in the end, the commission, this is in the UK, it managed to recommend 1%.
Yes.
1%, whereas actually what you need is probably a 30-fold increase.
Yeah.
And even that 1% was not implemented because of further lobbying of the government by the banks. So, yeah, the more you kind of look at this, the more you understand that there's going to be another financial crash. I mean, it's a question of when, not if, because the fundamental problem hasn't been resolved.
And just going back, I mean, your fundamental motivation with your anti-textbook, as far as I understand it, is to promote critical thinking. And from what you're saying then, are you saying that maybe there was a brief opening post-crash to a bit more critical thinking or a bit more openness? Is that closing, do you think?
I do, yeah, I do. So, I mean, I don't know, those students that demanded more pluralism, I don't know if that movement is, well, in your opinion, because you're more, I think, in touch with that.
It's still going. The numbers of groups around the world, have been generally increasing over time. There's over 100. But I haven't seen any evidence that there's much of a response from the teaching profession as such. I mean, I certainly, I don't think they can trumpet that. I think they make sure that their people in their groups are able to access other learning outside the courses they're doing and aware of the limitations of the courses they're doing. But in terms of the actual nature of the courses themselves, they stay basically the same. And they've had lots of different campaigns to try and change that. And I'm not aware of any real success.
Yeah, so there we are. Well, what I tell my students is that there's various approaches. I mean, I had a superb graduate student, and we looked at the natural rate hypothesis and hysteresis, because this is another thing that really strikes to the heart of the mainstream model. I mean, if you don't have a stable equilibrium to which the economy is always tending, then the whole thing goes up in smoke, and it's wide open for multiple equilibria and all this stuff. So we looked at that, and he, after doing that as his thesis, he went off to a mainstream university and did mainstream neoclassical economics and graduated with a very good PhD. But now he's a prof, he can kind of do more what he's interested in. And I do think it's extremely valuable to know the mainstream economics inside out, because you have to know it inside out to be a good critic. But
I'm just thinking, do you market your program on the basis that it is more critical, and do you think you get more people interested in coming to study economics at your university because of the anti-textbook and promoting more critical teaching?
I don't think so. I don't think we're that well known. I mean, I do remember we got one graduate student, and in the party where we were welcoming them, everyone said, well, why choose UMB? And it was music to my ears when this one particular student said, I chose UMB because I read the Economics Anti-Textbook and the authors were here at UMB, so, oh, yes. This is good.
Wait. But that's a pretty rare event, is it?
Extremely rare. But within the universities, students have a choice to take the mainstream course or the critical perspectives courses. And I actually teach both. Right. So I do the mainstream, where I'll just teach them the mainstream stuff and a couple of things, underneath my hand. By the way, that's a load of rubbish. And then I actually do the critical perspectives course, where we get into it. And the hope is that so I've taken various alternative approaches to teaching introductory economics. And the most successful one is this one, the critical perspectives one. I find that this attracts the better students, the best students actually.
Right.
And then if I can get them interested in economics, then we can bring them into the main program, which is actually where I was going when you stopped me and asked another question, which is that, I mean, fortunately, there are graduate programs available around the world and in Canada that are heterodox, that are pluralist. So you don't have to go off and do mainstream economics if you're doing graduate work. But yes, so the idea is to stimulate their interest and bring them in, get them in doing economics, make them realize that economics is way more interesting than they would have thought. And actually, there is room for heterodox views and for critical thinking within the economics camp. There is, definitely. I mean, there's journals and stuff. And,
yeah.
You know,
and is that increasing? Do you think? Is there more room for?
Well, it's a bit of a worry that perhaps the profession is becoming, you know, increasingly siloed. We do need to keep talking amongst ourselves, but I mean, within the Canadian Economics Association, there's a little group that has its meetings on the side, but it's advertised for everyone.
Yeah.
And you know, the heterodox group and the economics education group and so on. So that aspect and the number of journals where one can publish one's ideas, you know, without being just, you know, thrown out because it's critical of the mainstream, has increased. Yeah, I think that has increased.
Well, I think that's a good positive point to end on. And I really hope that your new anti-textbook macroeconomics book is really successful and people do ask your questions around the world. And I'm certainly going to promote it around Rethinking Economics and all their groups, because I think it's fantastic material for them to use.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. It took a long time to write it, and I am actually very pleased with the results.
Brilliant. I was too.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
Cheers, Henry. Bye-bye.